Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, the 3rd of July, 2024. Today we're going over Major Hurricane Beryl. It is still a Category 4 hurricane, and it is now approaching the island of Jamaica. So we have a lot to go over today. Let's get started off first with a satellite image of Hurricane Beryl. You can see the island of Jamaica right near the center of where Beryl is going towards. And over the next several hours, conditions are going to continue to deteriorate over the island of Jamaica, especially the southern portions where they're going to get the worst of Beryl. That's where the eye wall, and potentially we could still see Beryl shift to the north enough that it could maybe barely cross over some portions, or its eye could barely graze maybe some portions of the islands. But nonetheless, this is still a major hurricane. And even if this doesn't make landfall in Jamaica, it is still probably going to bring Category 4, maybe high-end Category 3 winds with it, because it is still a Category 4 hurricane. Although you could see Beryl is slowly beginning to degrade, as I mentioned earlier, as we mentioned yesterday. There's lots of shear in this part of the Central Caribbean. Lots of upper level, or not upper level shear, but there's a lot of shear, directional, shear in the atmosphere, which is causing Beryl to weaken a lot. And it'll continue to do so over the next several hours, but it is definitely not weakening to the extent that we would want it to. If we take a look at the National Hurricane Center latest advisory as of 11 a.m., it is still a Category 4 hurricane mid-range at 145 miles per hour with the minimum central pressure of 954 millibars, and it is located at 17.1 north and at 76.1 west, and it is moving west-northwest at 18 miles per hour. But I wouldn't focus right now, especially for the island of Jamaica, at the precise movement or the general movement of the storm. I would really focus on the precise little wobbles that we have, because that is really going to shift things when it comes to landfall over the next several hours, or maybe no landfall and potentially the eye wall just grazing the southern portions of the islands. But if it's any sort of silver lining, is that Beryl is weakening slowly, not as quickly as we would like it to, unfortunately, but it is weakening right now. And you could actually see that by the latest recon data that has been in the storm endlessly since early this morning. And you could see, since recon has been there over the last several hours, notice how the pressure slowly went up from 953 millibars that recon found earlier today to now it is up to 960 millibars. So that is definitely a reflection of the shear that we talked about happening with Beryl. It is definitely impacting the storm, but very interestingly enough too, you can also see on recon whenever the center kind of takes a little bit of a jog to the north, or maybe then kind of jogs a little bit more to the west. And once again, it's really going to be these jogs that we watch for in terms of what that'll mean for impacts on the islands. But generally, it is going to move west-northwest over the next several hours. It's going to shift a little bit more towards the west later on. And then after Jamaica, we got to watch for the Yucatan Peninsula next getting a hurricane impact from Beryl. Likely to be a weaker hurricane. Once again, it is weakening right now. Conditions are not really that favorable for it to intensify. Lots of shear. But it's still probably going to be a major hurricane as it passes by Jamaica. And it's even probably still going to be a major hurricane into tomorrow. And then it'll maybe weaken. The National Hurricane Center has a Category 2 on approach to the Yucatan Peninsula, and there are actually hurricane warnings in effect right now for the northern part of the Yucatan, or at least the Mexico part of the Yucatan Peninsula. There are watches and warnings, though, in effect for Belize as well, and even parts of the northern Yucatan near the Bay of Campeche as well. There's also watches and warnings at this point. And then it moves into the Bay of Campeche, into the Gulf, and then you could see the National Hurricane Center, as of the 11 a.m. advisory, now forecasts potential re-strengthening of Beryl, even if it weakens down to a tropical storm, which it might do so. Depends, once again, on how strong it is on approach to the Yucatan. But it could potentially re-strengthen in the Gulf of Mexico, especially as we get towards day 4 and 5. But what does that mean for potentially the United States as well, even northern Mexico too? As the story goes, it is too far out to really, it's getting a little bit on the far out range in terms of what that means, in terms of where it's going to see the direct landfall. It's only 5 days. It may seem like only 5 days, but in the hurricane tracking world, especially with a hurricane like Beryl, which has been pretty much unpredictable so far throughout its entire life, really. Um, 5 days out is a long, long time, and it's really going to depend on what exactly happens right now in Jamaica. And I actually have a radar sort of shot from out of Jamaica right now, and you could really see Beryl is actually coming into frame. You could especially see on radar the most prominent part of the eye wall is the northern eye wall, which is why it is really significant in terms of how much of a wobble it takes to the north, how much if it maybe wobbles back to the west, or it goes or shifts a little bit back to the north again, because it's really going to have an impact on not only the winds but also the storm surge, because you got to remember there is also the storm surge factor to that too. And it's really going to depend because let's say if Beryl were to go a little bit further to the south, even if this stays offshore, which is generally the general consensus now, given that Beryl has been trending to the south over the last day or so, most likely we're going to see the eye, the direct center of the eye, pass just to the south of Jamaica, but there's still the eye wall, which will still with it bring the onshore flow, especially into portions of the southern part of Jamaica, and even into the part of Kingston as well. And it's really interesting because notice the land formation of the southern eastern part of Jamaica. Notice how it kind of looks like a bay almost. And this really is important for storm surge because whenever we have land formations like this, where it's basically a harbor, it really just acts sometimes like a funnel for the storm surge, which is not good at all. And that actually increases the storm surge values more. So it will really depend, especially for Kingston, because Kingston is probably the most populated part of Jamaica, I would assume. Not entirely sure, but I would assume Kingston is definitely the most populated part of Jamaica. And I can just imagine any sort of shifts to the north, and let's say we end up getting a landfall in maybe this part of Jamaica, that would mean the eye wall would probably be right where the part of Kingston is, and that would mean the direct onshore flow will be into Kingston, and that would probably mean the worst surge values would be in this general area as well, rather than if this kind of shifts a little bit further to the south, the eye wall will probably just graze the southern portions of the island, especially if this stays offshore, and we will probably see the worst surge into the far southern portions of the islands away from Kingston, which is obviously a very populated area. So it's really going to depend on this radar image. This radar image is really going to be what everybody's going to be watching over the next several hours as Beryl makes its closest approach to the island of Jamaica. But I'm pretty sure even if this stays offshore, there's still going to be hurricane force winds no matter where you are, and tropical storm force winds as well. Even though it's not hurricane force winds, tropical storm force winds are extending well beyond the center of Beryl. In fact, there's even still tropical storm warnings in effect for the southern portion of Haiti, because they're still seeing tropical storm winds with Beryl as well. So that'll mean no matter what, even if this does not pass as a major hurricane directly over the island, some areas will still probably see hurricane force winds either way, and the entire island will see tropical storm conditions, which in itself is a threat, and can potentially cause loss of life and stuff like that. And also there's heavy rain too, which will potentially cause a flooding risk, mudslide risk. There are very mountainous areas of Jamaica, and that kind of enhances the flooding risk with the storm as well from the rainfall. So there's just a lot of risks to take into consideration that'll be there no matter what, whether or not we see the storm make landfall in Jamaica or just pass to the south But I guess when it comes to that aspect, it's in seeing the worst impacts for the island of Jamaica. It's really gonna be determined by the wobbles it has between now until it passes west of Jamaica and becomes much more of a concern, and becomes the main focus very soon for the Yucatan, and then eventually into the Gulf of Mexico. And going back to that part of what we're going to watch as this traverses into the Western Caribbean and traverses into the Yucatan, and then what we watch for in the Gulf, I really want to point out is that there is lots of uncertainty, especially past the Yucatan, in the model guidance right now. Here's the 12Z plots from all of the models, and we range all the way from potentially seeing impacts to Texas, which some of the models like the GFS and the HWARF show, to some agreements, and there's some sort of agreement that the models are starting to make that maybe this could be more of a northern Mexico hit. But the model guidance is still very much spread on what happens. It's really going to depend on Beryl. Even with Beryl in Jamaica right now, if Beryl shifts a little bit to the north, and that ends up going right over the island of Jamaica, that'll probably disrupt the inner core of Beryl a lot more. So maybe it'll be weaker in the Caribbean as opposed to right now, which you can actually see really a lot of the model guidance has shifted a lot. We really shifted away from looking at a direct landfall on Beryl on Jamaica, which does kind of alleviate some of the impacts in terms of maybe the winds, but the storm surge will be there, and arguably, as I mentioned before, there will be still the eye wall will probably still graze portions of the southern part of Jamaica, and that'll probably still be a huge storm surge risk as well, and arguably that could be potentially worse in the storm surge for southern portions of Jamaica. So it's really about getting through the next several hours as Beryl passes through, and then what it does right now and how it ends up in the Western Caribbean. It'll really impact the track as to what we see in the Gulf of Mexico. And let's actually take a look at the models right now really quickly. We're going to go to the European later, but let's look at the GFS first. The GFS, as I mentioned, in this 12Z run, it kind of shows it going into the southern Texas, this red model here, the AVNI, that's the GFS. I guess this is probably the 6Z plot, but initialized at 12Z. I don't know, the models, they tend to be a little bit confusing, especially when it comes to these plots, but the latest actual 12Z model run of the GFS, you can see Beryl obviously passes just to the south of Jamaica, and then it moves on into the Western Caribbean, probably still weakening at that point. The storm does not look like it's going to do much in terms of any sort of strengthening between now and the Yucatan Peninsula, although the hurricane models do kind of hint that there's maybe a small window of opportunity right before it heads into the Yucatan that Beryl tries to intensify very slightly. That'll also have implications on the track too, but the GFS obviously showing a weaker solution, and then because of that, notice how weak it looks on the GFS in the Gulf, and then because of that, it ends up taking a further south track, and as of the 12Z run, it ends up basically in northern Mexico, as opposed to the 6Z, which obviously had a lot more of a potent storm, and notice what the 6Z run did on the GFS. It took it right into southern Texas as opposed to northern Mexico on the 12Z run. So there's even changes that we see from run to run of certain models as well that have, or we know them for having, a certain solution on this. So really a lot, once again, is going to depend on what Beryl does within the next several hours and days as it continues into the Western Caribbean and then into the Yucatan, and then it moves in over northern Mexico, and then we get towards the 5-day mark. The GFS already has it inland over northern Mexico, and then really quickly there is something else in the Western Caribbean too. And by the way, I'm going to mention it really quickly, there is 96L as well, which only has a low chance of development right now, although I will mention the National Hurricane Center did extend its cone of potential development into the Caribbean today. And also satellite appearance-wise, 96L has definitely improved this morning as well. It's not going to develop. It's probably going to bring just heavy rains and potential flooding conditions to the islands, which is unfortunate given that they're still having to clean up and recover, or they're just barely into their recovery after Beryl. But this is 96L, moves into the Caribbean, and then at day 5, what you see right here in the Western Caribbean is indeed 96L as it traverses the Caribbean, which is why I brought it up. Just wanted to throw it out there. We might have to watch. Maybe it's not over. After Beryl moves inland, or depending on what Beryl does, that'll also have an impact on maybe this potential system that the GFS shows 5 days out too. But just throwing that out there as something to keep in the back of your mind. Don't focus on it too much just yet. So that's the GFS solution on Beryl. What about the European? And I'm actually going to bring it to the 0Z because that goes out to 5 days. Goes out to 10 days in total, but this one extends up to at least 120 hours. And the European brings us as well, just south of Jamaica, but also on a little bit more of a southern trajectory into the Yucatan Peninsula. And because of that, it shows a more southern solution into the Bay of Campeche. And the GFS has it more towards northern Mexico, even close to the Texas border. The European has this a lot more further south and a lot closer to maybe the central part of Mexico, rather than near the Texas border, which is what the GFS showed in the 12Z. And in the 6Z, obviously, they showed it making landfall in Texas. Let's actually really quickly compare. So that's I don't want to do that. That's the Euro at 0Z, and this is the GFS at 12Z. Definitely a noticeable difference, and that definitely goes to show there's lots of uncertainty right now. Lots of things we need to be factoring in and watching out when it comes to Beryl over the next several days, and it's going to be a lot of waiting and seeing. But even if you're in the cone of uncertainty, don't let your guard down, especially those in southern Texas. Watch out. Definitely keep an eye on to what Beryl does over the next several days, and it's really going to depend on what it does now as it passes through Jamaica, which should honestly be the first thing that we watch out for and kind of keep an eye on first before anything else, since we obviously have imminent impacts to Jamaica, possibly still as a major hurricane. Well, I mean, definitely as a major hurricane, but possibly even as a Category 4 hurricane still. With Beryl, just kind of continues on this unprecedented sort of journey that we've been with Beryl first making a landfall as a Category 4 in the Windward Islands, then becoming a Category 5 in July, the earliest on record in July, and also the strongest as well on record in July too. And now we're potentially looking at major hurricane impacts to Jamaica. Boy, it never ends, hopeful, but it will soon. And hopefully Beryl will soon be out of here and done with, and then we'll have to worry about whatever else the Atlantic throws at us. But a lot of tracking over the next several days and even over the next several hours. And if you're in Jamaica, I pray and hope that you're safe. If you have relatives in Jamaica, definitely continue to check in on them up until, of course, you can't do so anymore. And if you're in the Yucatan, watch out for Beryl and watch what its intensity is and how much it fluctuates in intensity over the next several hours, especially as it impacts Jamaica. And then if you're anywhere beyond the Yucatan, especially in portions of Texas, if you are in the Texas Gulf Coast, all I can tell you right now is wait and see, and keep an eye out on Beryl and what it does over the next several days. It's just a wait and see game right now, and we'll definitely do so here, right here on YouTube and on Twitter. I'm encouraging you guys to follow me if you haven't already on YouTube and on Twitter as well. Same name on Twitter. We'll definitely be doing a lot of that over the next several days into the end of the week. And I'm sure as this hurricane season continues, probably a lot more of that, but hopefully at a later time right now, and we get Beryl done with first. With that being said, I'm going to end it off for today's video. Any more updates from today will probably come via Twitter. Or maybe if something dramatically changes, I'll post another video here on YouTube. But watch out for the rest of my updates today on Twitter. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, especially if you're in Jamaica. I hope that you remain safe, and definitely for the next few hours, just ride it out and just pray, hopefully, that all will go well, indeed. With that being said, have a great rest of your day. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we'll talk again very soon.